This media is brought to you by Polyscope.
In the realm of tomorrow, where techniques mind, we ponder, we dream.
Let's jump in then. So, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to finally meet you because this is how we meet each other nowadays, over Zoom. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, so my name is Adam Bai. Somewhat weirdly, I come from an academic anthropology background. I did my graduate work researching innovation and emerging technology, in particular the social, community, linguistic aspects of it. And a lot of the research was in China. And I was trying to look at what happens when the Chinese state decides that a particular city or region is going to be innovative. How you engineer innovation from the top as though it's a recipe, and what happens when you try the recipe. So that's kind of my background, and I've always been fascinated by the unintended consequences of technology and all of those reasons aside from the technology itself that determine whether a particular technology will succeed or fail.
Yeah.
Why you get VHS instead of beta, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And,
What's really interesting is that everybody who I've interviewed who's in the innovation space has come from so many different places. Like
yeah,
some have been tech, some have been sales, some have been marketing. So people who gravitate to innovation come from everywhere. I mean,
yeah,
philosophy, tech. It's crazy because it's kind of a mashup of all of those things because
yep,
you need the technology side, you need the philosophy side, you need the sort of futurism side to sort of think
yep,
about where things are going in
absolutely.
order to innovate. But it's
Yeah.
interesting that you say there's did they actually succeed at doing sort of top-down innovation? Because I've never seen top-down innovation do very well.
Uh, yes and no. I think
Hmm.
in a lot of regions, no. In a lot of regions, yes. And I think
Okay.
there are two ways you can do top-down innovation.
Hmm.
There's kind of strategic industrial policy, making sure that people have the resources and the space and the ability to circulate between universities and funders and companies and all that. And that's certainly quite top-down. But
Hmm.
then you're also in that system providing the room for people to innovate. And of course, I mean, this sounds like a stupid thing to say, but innovation is one of those weird processes where you can't plan the outputs in advance. So
Exactly.
normal state economic planning doesn't work as well. You can't say like, we're going to have 10,000 tractors in 5 years. That's not very innovative. It's more like
Hmm.
we're going to create a process and a set of relationships, even a community, such that people can create unexpected stuff that doesn't yet exist. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And, one, I think, truth is that for all of the cities in the US and Europe and China that tried to recreate Silicon Valley, most of them failed. I
Mm.
think most of them that tried to create hubs that could connect with global flows that already existed and interact with Silicon Valley, many of them succeeded. So I think it's a
Interesting.
different kind of ambition. Yeah. And it's funny you said about all people from different backgrounds kind of being attracted to innovation space. And it makes me think of like Schumpeter's famous definition of innovation, that it's a kind of recombination of disparate elements. And I think when you pull elements from really crazy places, sometimes if you manage the process right, you get really, really amazing innovation, as opposed to having everyone from the same kind of background.
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, and it's funny because I remember going into innovation workshops and bringing people in and talking to them about what we'd like, what kind of outcomes we'd like out of the innovation workshops. And one of the comments I get a lot of times is, "Oh, you want us to enter the land of make believe?" And I'm like,
Mhm.
"Yes, we want you to leave where you are today. Like, stop thinking about the problems of today and
Mhm.
focus on the problems of tomorrow, or the problems like if you had no restrictions, if you had no barriers to the work that you wanted to do, what
Yeah.
could you do?" And
Yep.
sometimes it's very difficult to get people to think outside that kind of box because they're so focused on their box day in, day out. I mean, do you have any suggestions on ways of helping people to sort of think outside the box in that way?
Yeah. I mean, I find that because prior to Glimpse, which we'll get to in a minute, which is the company I'm helping lead right now,
Hmm.
I had helped start a company that actually just got acquired a few weeks ago called Nomadic Learning, which largely did sort of innovation and functional transformation through learning work. So the idea was cohort-based learning at massive scale around innovation challenges, case studies, etc. So not the typical like, here, memorize 10 ways to be a leader, much more like, here's a sort of indeterminate story. Look at it with people in your team or with people in China or France or whatever, and then decide if any of the lessons might apply to what you're doing, and then figure out how to apply them. And one thing I figured out is that people often conflate the tactical with the strategic in a way that totally destroys any potential for innovation. So you'll say, like, what do you want to innovate? And they'll say, I want to be able to input this stuff into the old survey platform 10% faster. That would be awesome. Of course, that can be a helpful goal, but people find it very difficult because they're conditioned by the work that they do, the practices that they're engaged in, and the positive feedback from other people around them to actually go beyond that sort of narrow tactical lane and say, like, oh, actually what I'm trying to do is figure out what people think about X.
Right.
Maybe I shouldn't be trying to get them to fill out the survey 10% faster. Maybe I should totally rethink my research process. And I think that quite often, if you spur people, give them a safe space to think a little bit more broadly, they're able to imagine a future that doesn't yet exist and then begin the process of innovating. But you have to kind of break them out of that initial focus on narrow tactics.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to sort of get out of the systems that they're in today, right? I mean, they can imagine it, but then how do you break out of it, right? I mean, it's kind of like when it comes to innovation, it's like you can generate tons of great new innovation, but what will come out of it? Like what actually becomes true product? Like what is your real result?
It's funny. When I was doing my grad research in China, I needed cash, and I was doing some consulting for Nike in China. And they had these Chinese engineers, of course, are helping. They were sort of the liaison between the factories and the folks in the US. And the people in the US hired me because they were concerned that the Chinese engineers weren't innovative. And of course, I already knew this going in. The problem was not that Chinese people are like inherently not innovative or that those people didn't have any ideas. It's just that they assumed that that's not what was actually wanted. That they assumed that they're supposed to like make a process more efficient and take orders. And so the Chinese engineer that I interviewed, one of them, had this really amazing phrase that sticks with me to this day. And they would take like a shuttle bus from the city that they lived in southern China to the factories to help the factories, help manage the factories. And they said that we have bus ideas. We have lots of ideas on the bus. Then once we get off the bus and we go into the factory, we don't have innovative ideas anymore because no one cares. No one listens to them. So we talk to each other about them, but then we get off the bus and they disappear. So as you say, it's not just a question of coming up with good ideas to transform the future. It's also about an entire system to listen, to apply them, to try MVPs or experiments, to generate the data to prove them out, to convince stakeholders, audiences who might have wildly different interests or even like cultural stereotypes that are quite negative about you to listen to your new ideas. And, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, no, and I love that idea because that's exactly what happens, right? I mean, you've got people who generate these great ideas, but they have no one to listen to them and nothing ever happens to them. And the reality is that anyone, anywhere within any organization can generate fantastic innovations, but we just never hear about them because they're not expected for like you said, they're not expected, or the system is designed to keep people sort of like in line doing their specific thing, the cog in the wheel, when they have so many things that they could contribute to the organization. So it's kind of like an organizational issue, right?
It's an organizational issue, and even if you want to put an even wider lens on it, it's probably a national education system issue to train people to think differently. And I would say, at the risk of sounding kind of like sappy and HR-ish, it's a kind of empathy and listening issue.
Right.
That is, if you listen really effectively to the kinds of challenges that people have elsewhere in the world beyond your immediate team or scope, those challenges will kind of like gnaw at you, and you can't help but think like, there has to be a better way to solve that challenge. But it has to register first as something that's interesting and worthy of your attention. And I think, interestingly, that's kind of that's a good segue to Glimpse, because that's largely what we think we're doing.
Mhm.
it's enabling people to listen more effectively to the challenges, needs, desires um, of huge audiences out in the world in a way that actually promotes empathy and understanding.
Very cool. Very cool. So actually, to add a little sort of political lens to it too, it also there's also a capitalistic bent to this thing, right? Because if you
Yeah.
like look at ROI, what's the ROI in innovation? It's
Yep.
like the ROI in innovation is so this, you can't conceptually put a number on it because you have no idea what comes out of it,
That's
right?
right.
So
That's right.
there's even a
Yep.
capitalistic driver which says we don't care what happens 5 years,
Yeah.
10 years down the road. We care what happens in the next quarter. And
Yeah.
that limits a lot of what you're doing. That's why sort of
That's a
public
that
entities.
yeah,
Go ahead.
that's such a great point. And so I'll like amend what I said in response to your great point, which is it's not just a question of broadening your scope sort of horizontally to what else is going on, behind you or in your peripheral vision, other teams, other people, other cultures. It's also thinking according to a different kind of temporality.
Yep.
So it's not the immediate quarter, it's 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Um, but at the same time, not forgetting that what happens in the quarter will determine whether or not your path to the incredible breakthrough innovation in 5 years actually happens or not. And
Exactly.
that's always tough to balance. But I totally agree. It's almost teaching people that it's very important to keep a different time horizon in their mind, even against all of the pressures of global capital and the way it tends to encourage people within organizations, especially to only innovate insofar as there's demonstrable shareholder value in the next quarter, which of course ends up gutting shareholder value over the next 5 years. But then maybe the CEO's gone and it doesn't matter, or you haven't gotten promoted.
So it tells me we need more long-term thinking, that's for sure.
We definitely need more long-term thinking. I'm with you on that, and we need somebody to pay us to do long-term thinking. I think
Yes,
you've already
exactly right.
you kind of figured it out already, but there aren't that many like podcast host and innovation consultant and professor gigs. So I think we need more people inside companies where the organizations have a bit of, call it, faith that
Mhm.
if they carve out some space for people to think a little bit longer term, that the value that will be returned is much higher than what's spent.
Yeah, I think everybody needs a chief futurist. Like we need to, if we
Everybody
don't
needs
have a
to,
chief futurist,
uh,
you got to
yeah.
get one. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you about Glimpse, but jump
Not
in.
at all. Yeah. So anyway, after the academic stuff and after Nomadic, I started focusing on this company Glimpse that was started by my amazing partner Neil Dixit, who's really a product guy and a market research technology guy. And it started with the simple question, which was, if it's true that the best way to understand people is by listening to their language and understanding their emotions, and it's also true that we'd love to be able to do that at scale in a representative way, in particular by listening to groups of people that are historically under listened to. How can we enable the most people in the world to be able to do that and then
Hmm.
extract lessons and insights that they can apply to innovation or to marketing campaigns or whatever?
Sure.
And so we basically wanted to make surveys not terrible. That was the initial impulse. Just like with Nomadic, we wanted to make digital learning not terrible. And it's not a bad way actually to start any kind of innovation process, to think about something that everyone universally agrees is kind of awful.
Yeah.
And nobody understands why it exists the way it does. Often there's a way to improve it. So
Yeah.
we
That's
started
if you
off.
think about it,
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
phrase sort of really does get right at the pain,
Yeah,
right? Because it's the pain. The pain. Something
exactly.
is horrible, something's not working right. You need to attack it. And that's the best way to jump into it from a startup perspective. Go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, but then as we started making surveys not terrible by doing things like creating our own natural language processing models to look at open-ended questions at really massive scale, to be able to recruit thousands of people in hours in a really targeted way from any walk of life in almost any country, whether it's B2B or B2C, all that
Nice.
stuff's really cool. And it's useful. But then we started thinking, okay, that's just kind of like a better power tool. That's like a better drill,
Hmm.
vis-a-vis previous or competing survey platforms. But how do we create a new way of thinking about research that gets embodied by a platform or encoded in a platform? So we started thinking, okay, well, in terms of inputs, maybe it's not just surveys. Maybe it's lots of data sets, structured and unstructured. Maybe it's interview transcripts. Maybe it's social data. Maybe it's transaction stuff. Maybe it's net promoter score stuff. what if we could throw all that in? And then what if the way we interact with the data is not just to create like research findings or insights, as they say in the industry, sort of like intermediate inputs into an innovation process? What if we actually help with innovation decisions or better content directly?
Nice.
And then we started thinking, what if we do cool stuff with all this generative AI technology that's coming out? And what if we actually enable synthetic audiences and digital twins? And I saw that you've done some work on your podcast talking about digital twins, based on segments of audiences, so that if you're the CEO or a presidential candidate or whatever, you could, if you built this digital twin properly, actually have a conversation in real time with your ideal audience member, your swing voter, your ideal buyer of your marketing platform, and ask, hey, I'm going to do this thing. What do you think about it? And you got feedback that was better than useless, that actually helped push the conversation forward. So we're trying to innovate the inputs part, the like talk to your data in a sort of normal conversational way part, and then the outputs part. And yeah, that's Glimpse. And we're used by, I'd say about half agencies and half brands, and started off with a lot of market research professionals and insights professionals, and now a lot of marketers and product.
Walk me through how it would actually work. Like, can I actually say I'm a candidate in a particular location? Can I say I would like to have a conversation with a typical voter, and you guys could create sort of an avatar of this voter, and I could have that conversation with that voter?
Yeah. Although, so that's a great question, and it brings up, I think, a really important distinction, which will become over the next 10 years really important, which is, you know, to forget nuance for a minute. Broadly speaking, there are kind of two ways to create digital twins, right? The first way is you're essentially drawing on an LLM or a set of LLMs, large language models, that are trained on, you know, you could say the corpus of the internet, but really, you know, the scrapable parts of the internet.
Sure.
And then from there, you extrapolate, right? You extend particular personas, and you say, like, how might they respond to something new that hasn't happened yet? That's one choice. That's not the road we took. We took the opposite route, which is to say, how do we start with small data? So how do we create a really secure foundation of first-party, good quality data that includes not only, you know, responses to multiple choice questions, et cetera, but also responses that show how people speak and write and use language, that shows how they feel about particular kind of topics that are related to, germane to the business concerns or political concerns or whatever that you have. And then draw on the LLMs in a really strategic way to extend the small data, to extend the power of it. So I can say that the first route is easier and cheaper and faster, but it's not what I would call kind of like enterprise grade.
Right.
You're not going to get really great outputs from it. This route that we've chosen is slower and more expensive, although, you know, not that expensive, not as expensive as kind of real research.
Right.
But we get much better outputs. So what we would do in the case that you're talking about is we would actually ingest really high quality survey data, interview data that's about voters. And then we would use kind of traditional, all automated in the platform, quantitative techniques to find statistically significant correlations between different voter types and different issues or messaging, whatever. We would define a segment that we really wanted to talk to. And then we would have a conversation with that voter segment. So maybe it's like, I don't know, you know, young male voters in the Midwest who love Joe Rogan, but might be persuadable Kamala voters, to take like a very, you know,
would you actually create an actual avatar and give it a name, and then the person could have a conversation with it?
We're going in that direction. So it could be like Joe the voter, but for now it's like you're having a conversation with a kind of personification of the segment, and you're saying like, hey segment, how might you react to X? And the system will say, this segment would react to this marketing messaging in X ways. You should worry about Y. Based on historical data, they would love Z. That kind of thing.
Wow, that's incredibly useful. I mean, it sounds like you're getting. And who are you targeting? I mean, who are typically your customers?
Yeah. So in the beginning, it really was like market researchers and insights professionals who wanted better surveys. And it still is to some degree, and that market's really important to us. I would say what's getting exciting now is that our kind of call it growth market, our future is largely determined by whether or not we can interest marketers
Mm-hmm.
in crafting better campaigns, better customer understanding, getting them closer to the buyer, salespeople to some degree, and really innovation people, which I think is a nice kind of loop back to where we started. And that is how, if you're an innovation professional, how do you bring to life the challenges of the people where you're trying to solve
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's both human, based in language and emotion and all that, but also representative and at massive scale. So you might be able to say, like, and this is a real example. Last year, 2 years ago, actually, we worked for an alphabet startup called Mineral, which is an ag tech MLAI company that got spun off, I think, recently. But they had this amazing software hardware combo where they would send like robots into fields and then help determine the local growing conditions and essentially make suggestions about what seeds to plant and all that.
Interesting.
And I mean, it's a really cool mission, because if you do that right, you don't need to rely on like pesticides and green revolution technology. You can manage risk in smarter ways with data. So we
Nice.
loved the kind of mission. It was really, but there were a bunch of engineers with a smart product, and they didn't really know where to take it to market. So, like, how do people in enterprise farms in like Brazil think about machine learning and AI? And we were able to get that depth where we were able to say, like, hey, when you hear the word AI, what do you think of? Do you think it'll be useful to you in 5 years, 10 years? And gather all that language, essentially code it instantly, and then tell them, hey, we actually think that Brazil is a more attractive initial market for you than France
Mm.
for these reasons. I mean, to take one example. Or we think mid-size enterprise farms, I mean, it's still quite big, are better for you than the biggest ones in the world for these reasons.
Oh wow. So you can
Yeah,
assist
that's
in
an
targeting
example.
as well in that way.
Yeah, you could, and for
Hmm.
targeting, for messaging, all that stuff. Anything that really depends on better, deeper, more nuanced audience or market understanding, I think.
Very, very cool. Very cool. So it's time to think like a futurist. It's 10 years out, the year
Yeah,
2034.
yeah, yeah.
Where will you be? I mean, obviously you're going to have the avatars are going to be there, but how sophisticated do you think this technology is going to get? Like, where are we going to be in 10
Yeah.
years?
So I think the avatar will be there. And I think that I've been thinking about this a lot because I knew it was a thing you were going to ask from
Hmm.
listening, reading the book. And I think that the future will be determined by the ways in which we understand the relationship between AI and groups of people, teams of
Mm.
people.
Mm.
I think that a lot of people now are really thinking about the relationship between AI and individuals, and they're worried about lost humanity or using AI as a tool or increasing productivity or whatever.
Yeah.
But we can already see some Glimpse clients and some places where I've done talks and so on, really these kind of like cyborg, I would call it, teams forming, where
Mm.
you have groups of people with different specialties, different levels of judgment or experience interacting with AI in really productive
Mm.
ways. And I
Mm.
think that the productivity of that relationship and its ability to do more than just drive efficiency gains, its ability to actually innovate, will depend on, yeah, of course, the quality of the LLMs and all that. But I would say 10 times more, it'll depend on the way we rethink processes and we rethink communication between people. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people know the story, but like in 2016, I think OpenAI published this like blog post where they were trying to work on an early version, of one of the LLMs, and they had it play a boat racing game. And the goal of the boat racing game, just like a stupid computer game, was to, get across the finish line first and earn points along the
Sure.
way. And they said, okay, go figure out how to win. But instead of ever going towards the finish line, the boat just went around in circles and set things on fire forever, eternally. And it like destroyed every human player. It won many more points. So it's like, okay, well, what's the problem? It's like very funny, but it's like, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that it's sub-optimizing for the wrong goal, for a
Right.
goal that people don't have.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, there's a couple of Toronto professors who wrote a book I really like called Prediction and Judgment about AI. And this is the lens I use to apply to it. It's like, people are good sometimes at judgment based on small amounts of data. They're good at innovating, taking leaps of imagination, etc. AI is good at prediction, essentially. It's a prediction engine.
Hmm.
And the faster and cheaper prediction gets, the more valuable judgment is. And what I would say is, to a large degree, the future depends on how well people engineer in moments of friction, human judgment, into AI powered processes. And at Glimpse, that's what we're trying to do, right? The goal is not to replace like marketers or innovators. Of course, people will be displaced, job market will shift. I'm not going to downplay some of the negative or scary
Yeah,
consequences.
things are going to change. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Things are going to change. But our question is, if we take a team of marketers or a team of innovators or a team of political consultants or whatever, how do we make them smarter, faster, and more innovative based on better audience understanding? And so that avatar that we talked about shouldn't be the little like cartoon character, of course, making the decisions. The avatar should be a team member that's interacting with the rest of the team in a really productive, natural way, such that the humans on the team can apply their judgment in ways that they never imagined possible. And that's, I would say, Glimpse is a small piece potentially of that future that I think it's worth working towards. And my suggestion, my advice is, if you're part of an organization, worry about like the data privacy and, do you use the OpenAI LLM or the Google or whatever, but worry a lot more about what your teams are going to look like in the future as they draw on the power of generative AI to supercharge human judgment and become potentially more innovative. And then the flip side is a lot of decision making could get black boxed, a lot of and become invisible. A lot of processes could be sub-optimized. A lot of decisions that are biased or even discriminatory or racist or sexist or whatever could become encoded in invisible ways in processes. So all of that could happen. All of that needs to be worried about. But I think the potential is really cool, but it depends much more on the human technical relationship than just on the technology.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. This is great. And if you noticed, I don't know if you saw that article recently by Meta, that they've figured out a way to use AI to train AI, and I'm thinking that's like a road to disaster, because we've already seen the junk that comes out of it.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting. So, I technically speaking, without getting too technical, that can be helpful in fairly closed systems where there's a kind of determinate, output, like where the right decision is clear. Say you're like a performance marketer and you want to tell like if ad A or ad B is going to be clicked on more. Training AI on AI generated data might be able to help you there, or where there's gaps in your data. But the thing Glimpse does that I'm most proud of is we're helping people identify patterns that don't yet exist, that nobody's yet recognized.
Which is exactly what AI is best at, really.
What AI is best at. But to do that, you need really high quality, original training data. And the data that you're inputting also needs to be super high quality. And what I tell clients, I mean, not just because we make money when we gather data, but also because it's true, is the fact that you're using generative AI for your market research doesn't mean at all that you should stop spending on interviews with real people, store visits.
Absolutely.
Videos of customer interactions.
A synthetic audience is not going to replace a real audience.
That's
not
right.
Just yet.
That's right. And also people, society changes, right? And you don't want to make extrapolations based on a snapshot of society 6 months ago. You want to make sure that you're always updating that little avatar so that he or she or it is giving you good advice based on the current state of the world.
Yeah. And things are changing so quickly now. It's almost like you need weekly updates.
Exactly. And you need really diverse sources of data too, to make sure that you're not locked into a partial view, to make sure that, you're kind of on top of the mountain with a panoramic view of what's going on. And the little avatar you're talking to has a similar view. And you're not like down in the valley looking at like some old transaction data that seems like it's being brought to life by generative AI, but actually it's just giving you bad advice. Yeah,
exactly right. Well, this has been great. Super, super fascinating. Thank you so much. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, so glimpseahead.ai, like glimpseahead.ai.
Nice.
Website. I'm Adam at glimpseahead.ai, or you can find me on LinkedIn at Adam Bai, B-A-I. I mean, I'm sure you can tell I have maybe too many things to say about generative AI. And of course, happy to talk to anyone about Glimpse and what we can do for organizations. I'm also really happy just to have an ongoing conversation about what's going on and would love to hear stories from other people. So please reach out.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it. Great spending time with you. Bye.
Pixels and philosophies merge and mold, a future untold, unseen.